Okay, so here's an example in which we are matching each graph with its equation. So we have 5 equations over here, and then 5 graphs. Get this one, 3, 4, 5 different graphs. Okay, so it's practice in matching polar graphs to their equations. So what we should do to help us out is use the notes I provided at the top of Module 5, the Chapter 10.345 notes. So let's go back there. Let's start with this one. We're looking for, looks like a rose. So I'm going to go back here to the notes. There they are. So part 5, the polar graphs. If you look for that, there's a rose. So the roses, the equations for the roses are like this: a sine n theta or a cosine n theta. So it might be a cosine 2 theta. It's got to be 2 theta for 4 branches. So a cosine 2 theta or maybe sine 2 theta. Let's go find that one. So is there a cosine 2 theta or a sine 2 theta? There's a sine 2 theta and there's a cosine 2 theta. Both. Okay. So how do we know which one of these it is? How are we going to tell one from the other? Well, basically, you see how this petal is centered on the x-axis? What that means when a petal is centered on the x-axis is that it's cosine. So if you I put that in the notes. If you look up here at the top of the notes, cosine is always centered on the x-axis. Sine is always on the y. There's one exception: roses with sine may or may not be centered on the y, but they're never on the x. So basically, cosine is always centered on the x. Sine is usually centered on the y. For sure, it's never centered on the x at the least. So that's how you tell the difference. Are the branches centered on the x or not? The petal is centered on the x, so that's got to be cosine. So this one is 3 cosine 2 theta, and I could check that one off. That's cosine. All right. Next, so let's go find the other one that's sine. It's got 4 branches. There it is. This has got to be 3 sine 2 theta, because see how the petals are not centered on the x-axis, right? We don't have a petal like this. The petal's right here and right there, and they're not centered. They're not right in the middle of the x-axis. So there's no petals centered on the x-axis. So this one's going to be the sine, 3 sine 2 theta. So we get those two. All right. What about this one's got a little squirrel thing inside, and so does that one. What makes that happen? Well, if we go back to the notes, here it is, right here. And that means it's of the form a plus or minus b sine theta or a plus or minus b cosine theta, where the a is less than the b. So it's got to have 2 numbers added or subtracted with a sine or cosine, and the number on the outside, the a, has got to be lower than the b. Okay. So, we go back to it. So it's going to be the form a plus or minus b sine or cosine of theta. So, well, that's these two for sure, right? And the a has got to be lower than the b. It is, right? 1 plus or minus 2 cosine theta or sine theta, either one, sine or cosine theta. The a is 1, which is lower than 2. So that works, and that works for this one also. Which is which then? Well, remember what we said about x-axis? See right here, we have the x-axis. So this one is centered on the x-axis, so that means it's cosine. So this has got to be the 1 plus 2 cosine theta, check. And the other one, see this one right here, the y-axis, centered on the y-axis. So this is going to be the 1 plus 2 sine theta. That makes it sine whenever it's centered on the y-axis. And that's been all semester, hasn't it? Sine is y and cosine is x all semester. Cosine is x, sine is y. So when you're centered on the y-axis, you're sine. 1 plus 2 sine. When you're centered on the x-axis, your cosine, your 1 plus 2 cosine. So we go, okay, we get the sine and the cosine. Now, finally, last one, 3 cosine 3 theta. That's going to be right here. It's the 3 branches, huh? It's only one left. But even if it wasn't, we know this is right. Because there's 3 branches. If you look back to the notes on the roses and stuff, 3 branches is cosine 3 theta. When it's odd, it matches the number. When it's even, like 2, it has 4 branches. But if it's odd, 3 goes with 3. 5 goes with 5. 4 goes with 8. See how even doubles, odd stays the same. So 3 with 3. So getting back to it, we've got, it's got to be the, whoops, I am getting lost in my work. Where is it? Right there. 3 cosine 3 theta. That's got to be, and it's got to be cosine because see how the branch, the petal, is centered on the x-axis, so that makes sense.